Howdy, sir.
Hey,
Welcome back.
thank you very much. I'm in glorious black and white.
It looks awesome.
Thank you.
We're definitely having way too much fun with that. But anything you want to say before we jump into this?
No, this talk went about 8 seconds long, so I apologize for that. But yeah, I'm definitely be interested in any questions that people have afterwards because I think this was a good learning experience for me, and hopefully there'll be something that people will find or learn from my mistakes or from my successes.
Awesome. Cool. Well, the Slack channel is on display. So, yeah, if you've got any questions, ask them there. We will tackle them in Slack, and then after the session as well in the live Q&A. So, enjoy.
Hello everybody, my name is Aijaz Ansari, and I'd like to thank the folks here at 360 iDev for giving me the opportunity to speak to you here today. I'm a software developer at GoGo Business Aviation here in Colorado, and in my spare time, I'm very active in my mosque where I'm the head of security, and I also teach little kids. These different roles of mine sometimes interact very serendipitously, like for example when I had to create a contact tracing and registration app for our events. I had a QR code that we could sign and register people and also let them know if they needed to get tested for COVID-19. And sometimes my roles interact in kind of absurd ways. For example, there was this one time where I was wearing a Cookie Monster t-shirt which was hiding a loaded gun which I needed as a security director while I was teaching kids how to make silly hats using large sheets of paper. Oh, I'm also an iOS developer in my spare time, and this is what I wanted to talk to you about today. This is a graph of my sales over the last 10 years. And those spikes that you see over here, those spikes coincide with the Muslim month of Ramadan. If you are trying to create an app for the Muslim audience, you really need to get it to market in the first 2 or 3 weeks leading to Ramadan. If you miss Ramadan, you've missed the boat and you might as well wait for the next year. So it was interesting when I was approached by a friend of mine who said that he had this idea for an app which coincided with a feature set that I wanted to add to my existing app. It was 10 weeks before Ramadan and he said, I have an API, I already have this working on the web, but I want to make this into an iOS app. And I said, well, this can help both of us. I can do the iOS app, and I can also use this for my own app as a client. So my existing iOS app can now become a client for your web service, and I can use the same code that I'm using for your iOS app. So it was a win-win. But 10 weeks is not too much time for a brand new iOS app. In this talk today, I want to share with you really quickly, go down a list of things that I learned while I was making it, things that worked and things that didn't work. And hopefully by the end of this, you may learn something that you did not know, or you may become aware of something that you need to know. Let's start off. First of all, having a good metaphor is really, really beneficial. When we decided to make this app, we were trying to figure out how to explain it to each other. Now, this app was a social app that allows people to add reflections to different verses of the Quran. They can select different verses that they want to comment on and then stage them and then write something about them. And as I thought about this, okay, you're taking bits of data, you're staging them, and then you're collecting them together, and then you're committing a comment to it. I said, well, this is just like Git. Let's think about this as a version of Git. Let's think about this like we think of Git. And once we had that metaphor, it was very easy for us to communicate with each other, with me as the developer and the friend of mine who was the business expert. And we were able to quickly come up with a vocabulary that allowed us to exchange ideas. Having a good metaphor, having good architecture, super, super useful. That's one on the plus side. Communication. This was something that actually hurt us in the beginning until we were able to set up our expectations. When we're really excited about our app and we're sharing ideas and we're all in quarantine. This was the first few weeks of quarantine. We're sitting at home, we've got nothing else to do, and the creative juices were flowing, and we'd have ideas late at night, and we'd text each other, and then we realized that we were getting information overload. The constant interruptions were making it difficult to communicate effectively, and was making it difficult for me, for example, to work on actually coding the app. And if I were texting the other folks, it was making it difficult for them to figure out what they needed to do. So we had to set something in place to say, okay, let's back off a little bit and let's formalize how we communicate with each other. Let's work with emails, and then only if it's really necessary, we'll go to text messages. And that really helped, because without that, we were just getting constant interruptions. Use what you know. When you've got 10 weeks to make an app from scratch, that's not the right time to start learning Swift UI, for example. So it was nice in a way that this was a new app and there was no existing code to work with, so it would have been great to make this my first Swift UI app. But I had a deadline, and I could not afford to miss that deadline, because if I missed that deadline by a day, I missed that deadline by a year. So I wanted to be really conservative in that sense and choose the technologies that I'm most familiar with, so that I could reuse code from other apps that I've worked on and get ready for market as soon as possible. Trust is important. We had a very small number of people in our team that we were working with. I was the sole developer. There was someone who was the business owner, the friend of mine, who had the need for an app. And he knew how the website was being done, and he knew what his long-term goals were for how this web service is supposed to perform. There were other people as well, people who worked on the web backend. There were people who worked on the social aspects of it. But everyone had just one role. We all trusted each other, and we deferred to each other. And that was the thing. That gets difficult sometimes when when you've been in the industry for so long, to take a step back and say, okay, you know what? You're the expert in this area. I'm gonna assume you know better than I do, and I'm just gonna take a step back and go with what you're saying. Similarly, they did the same thing when I put my foot down and said, I know what I'm talking about when it comes to iOS development. This is the way we need to do it. If you do this thing, Apple's going to reject your app. Whereas if you do this thing, it's going to be really, really easy to go through the review process. Things like that. They trusted me in my area of expertise, and I trusted them in their area of expertise. That was another plus. Now here was a big minus: API issues. So I want to go through each of these things real quickly, because I think these are important. Just because an API exists, it doesn't mean that it's perfect. An API could have served the first client, which is usually a website. And what I noticed is that APIs that are designed for the web aren't necessarily the best APIs for mobile clients, because the considerations for mobile clients are very different than for web clients, where you have, on the web, for example, you have a browser. You pretty much guaranteed a good internet connection. You can assume you always have a good network connection. You can't assume that on a mobile app. So these fundamental differences in how mobile web clients work versus the desktop browser web clients work, these fundamental differences influence how APIs are designed. So we have to keep a close eye on that. There's also what I jokingly call the curse of being the first API client. I was the first API client, other than the website, the first mobile API client. And what happens with that is you get to exercise all of those edge cases, those boundary cases, and you start seeing where the API has some rough edges. So if you are ever in the situation where you are the first mobile client for an existing REST API, add some time in your estimation on how long it's going to take to get up and running, because you will find things that did not make sense in a browser client situation. Lack of uniformity is another red flag. If you have things like names that are names that are camel case, sometimes names that are snake case, other times these things can cause simple bugs, but bugs that you don't expect. So uniformity is important when you're looking at an API. One of the things that bugs me a lot is when an API returns a failure or tells the client that it's failed but does not return the proper status code. And that is something to look out for, because that can affect the kind of code you write on the iOS end. If the API returns a 200 HTTP code and then returns the error message in a JSON object, that's more code that you have to write, because you can't just trust that a 400 or a 500 is an error. Now you have to introduce error management code in your app. Get requests with a body. That was a big problem. Sometime, I believe, between iOS 12 and iOS 13, so I think calendarically somewhere in March of 2020, Apple changed the way they allow you to send GET requests. You can no longer send a body in a GET request. That's not standard. And if the web API allows you to do that or expects you to do that, that's going to be a problem, because your app will not run on iOS 13 and above. So it's very important to keep an eye out for that. And if you see that in any web APIs that you are using, bring it up right away, because that's going to have to change if you want an iOS REST client. And the last one is the one that gave me the most amount of trouble, which is field names in query strings. Let me show you an example. Now what we're seeing over here is a very complicated query string that has a bunch of parameters to an object named Q, for example, and the parameters are things like tag IDs and author IDs, filters, and how you're going to combine those filters. And when I look at this, having been a web developer myself in the past, what I see is that this thing looks like it was designed to be evaled in JavaScript. Now, I can construct a URL or a query string that looks like this in Swift, but I can't do it the right way. The right way is to use something like Encodable or Codable and use objects, and then have libraries take these objects and construct them into a proper request. The only way I could get around constructing the proper URL strings over here was to take strings and concatenate them. And that felt icky. You know what I'm saying? It felt that that wasn't the right way to do it. But it was the only thing I could do given the constraints of the API. So if you are working on an API or you're a client of an API and you see this, expect that you're going to have to write some gnarly code to go through that. On the plus side, we have Codable. Codable saved so much time. Just being able to create a model object and encode it and decode it. I happened to use AlamoFire, but I could have just as well used URL, just the Apple's URL session, and it would have worked just as well. If you're not using Codable, you owe it to yourself to start using Codable right now. This was the first heavy REST client that I had written from scratch, where I didn't have any baggage of previous existing code, so I could start off right from the bat using Codable. And let me tell you, it was such a pleasure to use this. Strongly recommended. There's no reason right now in 2020 not to use Codable if you have the opportunity to use it. On the negative side, you get weird JSON. Let's look at these two examples. Both of these JSON examples show the same kind of data. The first one has different authors' names as keys to an object. The second one has an array of objects that has two fields, name and number of posts. The second option is really easy to decode using Decodable. It's almost trivial. The first one requires you to write a custom decoder. It requires to create a keyed archive container, and it's just a pain in the butt. If you have to do this over and over again, that's a lot of code that you need to write. If it's possible to use, if you ever have a choice between the first and the second, always go for the second, because that's going to be a lot less code that you, as an iOS developer, have to write. Network and persistence. This was a really big deal. We spoke about this a lot. And I've actually had to do this in several different positions as an iOS developer. Where do you draw the line between being a pure REST client, where you just make requests and display the results from the response, versus being a first-class iOS app, where you make requests as you need it and then store the data locally? This app that I was working on, this Quran Reflect app, was really an app for browsing, first of all. And I would say, just like, for example, Stack Overflow, you have a lot of people who read and lurk versus the number of people who actually create content. So it was very important to be able to have a good experience right as soon as you download the app, even if you don't have a good network connection. So it was very important for us to save all of the data locally and save it into an SQL-like database. This meant that we were duplicating a lot of the structure that was there on the server, so there was code that I had to write that was already there on the server, but the benefits vastly outweighed the negatives. So I strongly recommend, when you have this question, should I save data locally or not, give the option of saving data a really good consideration. When we started testing, people couldn't read any of the text in my app. It's because I wasn't used to designing for dark mode. So always support dark mode. Otherwise, I never used dark mode, for example, until I started testing this app, and then I realized this is really cool. I just grew into using iOS 12, iOS 13 without dark mode, but my testers were using dark mode and they couldn't see it, and I'd get bug reports saying, hey, I can't see any text. It's because the text was black on black. Standard views, a big win for accessibility and voiceover. When you use standard, in my case, UIKit views, you get a lot of the benefits that Apple has baked in for voiceover. This was one of the big issues that we had in early versions of the app. People would get lost. Let's have a look. Here is the app. It's got 3 tabs. I click on the Home tab, for example, or I click on Read the Quran, and then I'll go and click on a particular verse, and then I'll clip that verse, and then you can see it adds a clip to the first tab. Now I can go back to the Home tab where I can continue my browsing. In early versions of this app, what we did is as soon as you clipped a verse, it would take you to the first tab, which was the Clips tab. And that was unbelievably jarring. People, including me, the developer, would get lost. How did I get here? And that's when I realized that one of the non-negotiable design rules is that when you have a tabbed view controller, you should never automatically move from one tab to the other. Never switch it automatically. Have the user initiate that action. Real quickly, debugging Alamo Fire is really useful. I wanted to share that with you. Over here, what I'm doing is, as I create a request, I call curl description using that request. What this does is it prints out, and I don't do this always, it's just when I want to debug, it'll print out the actual curl that I can copy and paste into my browser. And this is an example, into my terminal. This is an example of what it looks like. Really, really useful. The next thing that's also really useful is once you get a response, let's say you want to look at the response because your JSON object isn't being decoded properly, and you want to have a look at the response, you can do that by calling debug print, and that prints the entire response. PushHero was another big win. It's a really nice app for simulating push notifications. If you're doing push notifications, consider that. Finally, ZenHub, really nice addition to GitHub that's free for certain kinds of accounts like mine, because it's a nonprofit organization. It allows you to create stacks and lists of issues. You can create sprints. You can move items from one sprint to the next, just like you would in a really expensive agile software development app. Finally, Fastlane. Fastlane, I could give an entire 2-hour talk on Fastlane. I love it. I'm able to create workflows where I can increment my build numbers, make sure everything's checked in before I build, bump my version numbers, and then distribute. And it just works really well. If you're not using Fastlane, please consider doing so. That's it. 20 minutes and 8 seconds. I'll stick around for questions. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be glad to answer them. Thank you very much.
Welcome back.
Thank you very much.
Close that guy. All right, we'll see if anyone's typing questions. The one that I saw you answered was your camera rig. Which
Yeah. I think the things that were really surprising. Oh, any good resources for starting with Fastlane? Yeah. Ray Wenderlich has a really nice tutorial on Fastlane. It's an entire course on Fastlane. I thought that was really helpful. Fastlane has changed a lot in the last 2 weeks, so definitely look up the new stuff. What I've found helps a lot is using Fastlane with custom schemes in your app. So what I have is I have a deploy scheme that makes sure that I download the latest data from the server, because one of the side effects of having a network or having the app store the network data into the database, like I was talking about, one of the side effects is when you ship the app, when you submit it to the App Store, you want it to go to Apple with at least the latest data that you have at that time, so that as soon as the user launches the app, they're not looking at zero content. If the content is a few days old, that's better than nothing. So I have Fastlane actions that pull the data from the server, and it's all part of the build process when I go into my deploy scheme. So I think that's really useful.
Nice. Yeah, that makes sense. How did the app do?
The app, I think, is doing really well. One of the reasons I decided not to roll my own and work with this person's backend is because he already had the most valuable thing a social app can have, and that is contributors and experts who are actually producing content. So that's not something you can easily get.
Yeah.
I think the app still isn't ready for a massive marketing push, because there are certain things that if I hadn't scrolled so fast on that ZenHub board, there are certain things that aren't implemented yet. Deep linking from push notifications, depending on the context in which the push notification was sent. Those are all the sorts of things that promote virality or viralness, whatever the word is. And I think that's really important. So even though the app is version 1.0 when it's out in the App Store, I think a few minor things will get it to the next level.
All right. Cool. Let's see. That looks like it. If you have any questions between now and when we shut off this part, feel free to ask them in the Slack channel. Otherwise, we will be back in 7 minutes for, it was our last talk, but Tom has wrangled up a bunch of people into a Apple versus the world discussion panel. So we've got Josh coming up next for congratulations, your opportunity has arrived, followed immediately by Tom and a bunch of our attendees and speakers to discuss all of the current brouhaha around Apple that Josh and I kind of briefly talked about. There was enough comments in that Tom decided to spin up a chat, which the upside of an online event is it's easy to add additional bonus content. So,
well, thank you again. Everyone at 360 Adab, John, Nicole, and all the people working behind the scenes, Tom, everyone, I'm so glad we could do this, even if it was, if it wasn't in person.
Absolutely. Thanks for being a part of it. Twice.